Officer, can I also just take, with your indulgence, a moment to congratulate Vaughan Gething on his appointment as First Minister of Wales. His appointment as the first black leader of a government in the UK is a truly monumental moment, and I look forward to working with him. Vaughan Gething's predecessor, Mark Drakeford, was a principled First Minister, a model public servant, importantly a very fierce defender of devolution. I think the whole Chamber want to join me in wishing him well. Presiding Officer, to the matter at hand, first of all, let me say, when it comes to the hate crime bill, the Hate Crime Act, forgive me, there has been a lot of disinformation that has been spread on social media and some inaccurate media reporting and indeed by our political opponents. So I'm hoping this exchange we can shed more light than heat on what is actually in the Act as opposed to what is being said about it. In terms of training for police, let me say that I leave it as an operational decision and a matter for the Chief Constable to determine what training is absolutely appropriate. And of course, Police Scotland put out a statement just this week to challenge some of, in their words, the inaccurate media reporting that exists around the Hate Crime Act. So I've got absolute confidence in Police Scotland to ensure the appropriate training is in place. And let me just remind Douglas Ross, of course, that stirring up offences are not new in Scotland. You know, as a person of colour, I've been protected from anybody stirring up hatred against me because of my race virtually all of my life, since 1986. In fact, all of us are protected by that provision of stirring up hatred. The question is, if I have protection against somebody stirring up hatred because of my race, and that has been the case since 1986, why on earth should those protections not exist for somebody because of their sexuality or disability or their religion? So the facts are that for an offence, a new stirring up offence, to be committed, we know there is a very high threshold, in fact, an even higher threshold than the barrier that there is, or the threshold that there is for a racial stirring up offence. And I would say to Douglas Ross, it's incredibly important, in the memory of people like Henry Wooga, where he started his contribution, that we all unite in standing up and opposing hatred in all of its forms. And a strong legislative framework to protect people is incredibly important. I would urge the Conservatives, I would urge Douglas Ross, that it would be far better for him, I think, to put more effort into tackling hatred as opposed to opposing a hate crime act.
Douglas Ross. Can I echo the First Minister's comments and wish Vaughan Gething well as the new First Minister of Wales. But we opposed the legislation at the time and still oppose it now because of the impact it has on free speech for people across this country. And I'm only reiterating the points made by the Scottish Police Federation, the representative body of our officers across Scotland. They say that their officers can barely deal with existing crimes, let alone this new law. They described the Hate Crime Act as, and I quote, a recipe for disaster. Humza Yousaf has reduced officer numbers to the lowest level since Police Scotland was formed. Now officers are being told not to investigate actual crimes, but instead they'll have to look for the hate monster or police free speech. Criminals will be let off while innocent people are prosecuted. Isn't Humza Yousaf setting the police up for failure and undermining public trust in policing?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, with that contribution, it is Douglas Ross who is undermining the fight against hatred here in Scotland. Absolutely undermining it completely, utterly and entirely through so much disinformation. I don't even know where to begin. So let's take point by point of what Douglas Ross has said. First and foremost, he makes an incorrect claim around police officer numbers under the SNP government. Of course, under the SNP government, numbers of police officers have increased and will continue to increase, given what we have heard recently from the Chief Constable and backed by a record budget from this Scottish Government. And of course, there are more police officers per head in Scotland than in England, where his party is, of course, in charge. Let's take the points that Douglas Ross raises around the Act itself and freedom of expression. I remember, of course, because I was the Justice Secretary that took forward this bill, making sure that I engaged with opposition members around the issue of freedom of expression. There is a triple lock of freedom of expression in the Act. There is protection of freedom of expression that's actually explicitly embedded in the Act. There's also a defence available of a person's behaviour being reasonable, which safeguards people's rights. And thirdly, of course, the Act itself is compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights, including Article 10, which includes and protects everybody's right to freedom. When it comes to stirring up of hatred, presiding officer, stirring up offences are so pervasive, so damaging, so dangerous in our society. Let me just take Douglas Ross back to what Lord Bracadale said. Lord Bracadale, of course, was the one who reported on his independent review of hate crime, which then led to the development of legislation. He said, and I'll quote, "The stirring up of hatred can contribute to a social atmosphere in which prejudice and discrimination are accepted as normal." In any society, presiding officer, the freedom to criticise, the freedom to insult, the freedom to offend exists and should be treasured, in fact. But there cannot be freedom to engage in behaviour that is threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred. So everybody in this chamber, we engage, we talk often about our commitment to tackle hatred. Those who experience hatred tell me they don't just want warm words from their politicians, they want action, and that's exactly what this Hate Crime Act intends to do.
Douglas Ross.
But people want action that is enforceable, and the Scottish Police Federation are saying they have serious concerns. Their officers are receiving a 2-hour online training module for this legislation. And the First Minister keeps trying to say these are my comments. They're not. I originally was quoting the Scottish Police Federation. Let me now quote legal experts like Roddy Dunlop, the Dean of the...
Please continue, Mr Ross.
I think it's only right that we say ministers in the Scottish Government don't think we should be hearing from the Faculty of Advocates.
Please continue, Mr Ross. Let us hear Mr Ross.
Well, I can say it was Marie Todd. It was the Minister that said
Mr Ross, can I ask you to continue with your question? Members, can we please ensure that we can hear Mr Ross?
So, legal experts, including Roddy Dunlop, the Dean of the Faculty of Advocates, said there is a danger of the police being swamped by completely malicious complaints. Not my views, but the Dean of the Faculty of Advocates. Days before this law comes into force, it's unclear how those complaints would be dealt with by the police. People like J.K. Rowling could have the police at her door every day for making perfectly reasonable statements. That could lead to huge numbers of the public being monitored or even criminalised by the police when they have done nothing wrong. Isn't Humza Yousaf putting frontline officers in an impossible position by forcing them to police free speech?
First Minister.
No, presiding officer, we know it's often police officers, unfortunately, that are the victims of hatred themselves. They are often the ones who are facing hatred when it comes to the course of their duties. Presiding officer, Douglas Ross says he has no idea how a stirring up offence could possibly be enforceable. I'm making the point that a stirring up offence in relation to racial hatred has existed since 1986 with virtually zero controversy whatsoever. So I have absolute faith in Police Scotland's ability to police and enforce this Act in a way that is appropriate. In terms of the points that Roddy Dunlop, who of course I respect greatly, the points that I would say in respect to Roddy Dunlop is that police, again, are very, very well attuned, adept and have ability to deal with vexatious complaints right across the legal framework with which they operate. So I can't tell you whether there will be vexatious complaints or not. That will, of course, depend on people's actions. But what I can say is that the liability for criminal threshold is incredibly high. If you don't want to take my word for it, let's look at another legal expert. This one, Professor Adam Tompkins, I think known to Douglas Ross, formerly a Conservative MSP, somebody I worked with in relation to the hate crime bill. He writes in today's Herald, and he's of course a Professor of Public Law, and I'll quote from him directly. Offensive speech is not criminalised by this legislation. The only speech relating to sexual orientation, transgender identity, age or disability outlawed here is speech which, 1, a reasonable person would, 2, consider to be threatening or abusive, 3, which was intended to stir up hatred, and 4 was not reasonable in any circumstances. He goes on to say, just because you feel offended by what someone does not make it a hate crime. And then goes on to say, under the Hate Crime Act, the threshold of criminal liability is not a victim that feels offended, i.e. a subjective test, but that a reasonable person would consider the perpetrator's actions or speech to be threatening or abusive. So, Presiding Officer, let's stick to the facts. And the facts are this, that we are all purport to be concerned about the rises in hate crime that we've seen in our society over the years. But there's only some parties in this chamber that I believe are willing to take the action that is necessary to tackle it. It was, of course, an act and a bill at that point that was debated thoroughly in this chamber. It is unfortunate that the only party that opposed it, of course, was the Conservatives, Presiding Officer.
Douglas Ross.
In a democracy, we have scrutiny. We have opposition parties to look at the legislation coming forward. And there have been and continue to be serious reservations about this act that was passed and now how it will be implemented. Let's remember, Humza Yousaf introduced this unworkable and dangerous law when he was Justice Secretary. Now he's bringing it into force as First Minister with little training and not enough support for the officers who will have to enforce it. Let's have a quote from a Professor of Law at Glasgow University, First Minister just quoted. Alistair Bonington said this, "Like many of the SNP's attempts at lawmaking, this Act will be set aside when it is properly examined in a serious court." This looks like another SNP law that will have to be discarded, just like the named persons and the offensive behaviour at Football Act. We've said from the outset this law is a disaster in the making. It criminalises free speech. It risks a fundamental right. It's overreach by the SNP into people's homes. It could result in the public being criminalised for no good reason. It is set to be a shambles.
Let's hear Mr Ross.
It is set to be a shambles from day one in just 11 days' time. So will Humza Yousaf finally accept that he has created another bad SNP law that will quickly descend into chaos?
First Minister.
What's dangerous, Presiding Officer, isn't the law. What's dangerous is hate crime in our society, Presiding Officer. You see, Presiding Officer, we did debate this Act when it was, of course, a bill going through this Parliament extensively. Many years ago, robust debate. Actually, I thought debate is sometimes and often the best traditions of this Parliament. There was compromises. There was amendments that were accepted by the government. We came out of that process with a good piece of legislation that fundamentally protected people's freedom of expression, freedom of speech, but also safeguarded people's right not to have hatred stirred up against them. And of course, there was only one party that opposed that bill. Douglas Ross and the Conservative Party. And maybe, Presiding Officer, it's hardly a surprise, given that the Conservative Party, far from working hard to tackle hatred, they're a party that have actively created the conditions for hatred and division to thrive in our society. The Conservative Party, Presiding Officer, are the party.
Let's hear the First Minister.
The Conservative Party are the party of go-home vans, the party of the hostile environment, the party of Windrush, the party whose leader, Boris Johnson, called Muslim women
First Minister.
bank robbers. They are a party that indulges in Islamophobic smears from Suella Braverman to Lee Anderson. So instead of fighting against this bill, wouldn't it be better, Presiding Officer, that the Conservatives got their own house in order?